And we are recording, and now we can start. Welcome everybody to our first delegate resolutions training, going over Parley Pro and other aspects of the upcoming GA delegate resolutions debate procedure. Super happy to have you all here. My name is Jack Hill. I'm the Regional Affairs Director of Region I. And I'm also chair of the SSCCC's Resolutions Committee. And today with us as well is the SSCCC official parliamentarian, Scott Burns, who's going to be helping us out as well, telling us what we need to be remembering when we're debating resolutions and other important facts about parliamentary procedure. But with that, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So this training is going to be recorded and archived on the Student Senate YouTube channel. Since some people are not able to attend, we always want to make sure that resource is available. You are able to change your name and use an identifier if you do not wish to share your name. Live transcription has been turned on. Everyone is muted, so to speak, you can either use the raise hand feature or message your question to me so I can say it for you. Just that's to ensure security. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end as well. And one thing I just do want to mention in particular before we get going is please ensure your Zoom profile picture is respectful to all participants. We always want to make sure we have an inclusive space for everybody to come and learn. And that's what we want to ensure, that students are able to learn from our webinars. So please make sure that your profile picture is not offensive to certain communities and is just professional and respectful. But with that, I am gonna escape and then go to our, hold on. Oh, that's just gonna X out and then go to the orientation. I'm gonna click present. And also I'm gonna spotlight Scott so you guys can all see him and not me, but let me just do that real quick. Spotlight. Cool. Scott, everybody can see you and we are ready to start when you are.
All right, let me put a little more light on the subject here. So welcome everyone, and sorry for a little bit of delay. We had a little bit of a tech problem with my ability to screen share. So Jack's going to do the honors of saying next slide when I say it. And he's already behind the curve because I just said next slide. Jack, next slide. Okay, so first of all, let me just tell you who I am. And also, sorry, it's in kind of yellow there. I didn't realize it was faded, but there's my email address and my phone number. So we're going to be, I'm going to be giving about maybe a 45 minute presentation with Q&A at the end. But if after we're done today, you come up with some question or something you're not sure of, and you want to know an answer before we all get together this weekend, feel free to email me or text me, and I'll be glad to go over it. We will have Q&A at the end, so here's how I'd like to handle questions. If you just have a question, something about procedure, save it for the end because it's likely something that I'm going to cover anyway, and we'll get to it at the end with the Q&A. But if I say something that's confusing or you don't understand it and you need me to repeat it or explain it right now, then just enter something in the chat, and Jack or Dr. Adams are monitoring the chat. And if they feel there's a need to interrupt to cover something, they will go ahead and do so. And then lastly, this is the first of two presentations. We'll be doing it again live Friday in Sacramento. And so obviously, if we're all done, if you think it could have been improved in some way, feel free to shoot me a text or an email with suggestions. So with that, that first slide said rules of order. Next slide, Jack. Okay, AKA, also known as parliamentary procedure. So whether we're talking rules of order, Robert's Rules of Order, parliamentary procedure, whatever we're talking about, or I should say whatever authority we're using, whatever rules we're using, what we're concerned about here are the rules and procedures for conducting meetings efficiently and democratically. Your parliamentary authority is Robert's Rules of Order. It's not the only one, but it's got about 90% of the market share, and the others are essentially derivative of it. So when we talk about parliamentary procedure, we're essentially talking Robert's Rules of Order plus. And for plus, we go to the next slide. So there's a hierarchy of where you're going to find your rules of procedure. Okay. Everything higher on this list trumps anything lower. Okay. So at the very top, of course, are laws, corporation code for any of you that might be incorporated, the education code, the Brown Act. So obviously, if there are any rules of procedure that are a matter of law, those are going to control. Next level are your own constitution and bylaws. Now, typically, the legal and bylaws don't have a lot about procedure in them. They may have a few things that are basic minimal requirements, but mostly what we're going to be concerned about are either your own adopted policies and procedures. So for example, one of the things you'll be dealing with on Saturday are your own standing rules for handling the assembly. Also, you've got rules in your constitution and bylaws and your own policies for how resolutions can be submitted, how they can be amended. So those control next. Then there's Robert's Rules of Order. And Robert's Rules of Order are the meeting rules. So every organization has a lot of rules. Most of those rules take place outside the meeting context. So for example, your adopted policies and procedures have very detailed rules about how you can submit a resolution, the format it has to be in, where you need to put semicolons. So there's a lot of detail in there. That has got nothing to do with the meeting on Saturday. Or I should say, it's got nothing to do with the procedures of the meeting. Okay, today, we're not going to be discussing those particular rules. We're going to be talking about meeting procedure. And that's what Robert's Rules of Order covers, is meeting procedure. And then lastly, there's custom and practice. And what that means is, even if you don't have a rule on something, but you've been doing it the same way consistently for some period of time, that has the force of rule. And of course, the trick here is recognizing that if you've got a custom and practice that is contrary to something in Robert's Rules of Order or contrary to adopted policies, then you may not be able to continue with that custom and practice. You may be able to do so. And if that sounds confusing or speaking out of both sides of my mouth, that should be clear by the time we get to the end of the program. Next slide. Okay. So again, our focus is going to be on transacting business at the General Assembly, not how to submit resolutions, how to amend resolutions. You're probably all aware we've passed the deadlines for that. So next slide. Okay, so now we're going to, before we get into the actual procedures, I want to discuss some general principles. And it's important you understand the general principles, because Robert's Rules of Order, this 710-page epic, is full of hundreds of little detailed arcane rules that have come up since 1876 when the first edition was written. And every time something came up that there wasn't a rule on, somebody had to make a rule on it, and it got added to the book. So the book was originally 170 some odd pages. It's now 710. But the fact of the matter is, most of those rules are really just common sense written down in technical language. And so when you come to a situation and you're not sure what the rule is, most of the time, if you just kind of think, well, what would be the reasonable thing to do here? You're probably going to be right. So we're going to start off with some general principles before we get into the detailed rules of procedure. Next slide. So the first thing we need to recognize about parliamentary procedure is that it's intended to foster efficient democratic meetings. And I use those words in tandem because, first of all, democratic, the idea behind procedure is that if you have a democratic meeting, everyone involved in the meeting, or at least all the voting membership, everybody has equal rights. Everybody has an opportunity to participate. As you see on this slide, we're all entitled to full discussion. There's what's called and I should mention, by the way, that if any of these words don't make sense to you right now, they will be by the end of the presentation. But the quorum is the minimum number of people who need to be present in order to conduct business. If you don't have a quorum present, you can't conduct business. And that's a rule that's designed there to protect absentees. It's to make sure if you have a group with 100 members, 5 of them just don't show up in a room someday and take action that the others don't even know about. So in Robert's Rules of Order and in most organizations, a quorum is a majority. It can be typically a majority of the membership. In scenarios like General Assembly, it's a quorum of the registered delegates. So I don't know how many delegates your different colleges and campuses are authorized, but for purposes of our quorum, it doesn't make any difference how many are authorized. What counts is how many actually show up and register at the assembly. That establishes, once we know how many people have registered, a majority of them must be in the room to conduct business. Next, there's an agenda. Okay. We should know what business we're going to be conducting beforehand, or at least, if not before the meeting, at least as the meeting begins. So there's an agenda to establish, first of all, what the business is going to be, and also establish what the sequence is going to be, ideally with the most important things first, so that if we run out of time towards the end, it's the least important things that get put over to the next meeting. There's something called a consent calendar. And the consent calendar, and it's been borrowed from a lot of civic organizations, city councils, boards of supervisors, Congress. And the consent calendar is that portion of your agenda that is non-controversial. We don't really need to spend time. We need to take action on it, but we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's routine business. It's non-controversial. We're kind of all on the same page. So those items of business can be added to a consent calendar. And when we get to the consent calendar, essentially the chair just says, here's the consent calendar. If there's no objection, it's adopted. And then we've just dealt with 5, 10, 20, or 30 items all at once. The key principle about the consent calendar is that it really does need to be unanimity, unanimous consent. So if a delegate disagrees that something should be on the consent calendar, then there are measures in place for you to remove it from the consent calendar. It gets put back on the regular agenda in an appropriate spot. We're not going to get into details on that today. That will be explained more fully, I'm sure, on when we actually get to assembly. The next principle is full discussion, and that is almost everything is debatable. We're going to talk about it before we go to a vote. Now, there are some rules on the discussion, and we'll come to those rules in a little bit, but everything that is substantive is open to debate. There are some procedural motions, and if you don't know what I mean by motion, that'll be clear in a minute too. But there are some procedural motions that we don't talk about. We just do it or vote on it. That's because there's really nothing to talk about. And again, that will become clearer in a moment. The general rule is the majority rule. So when we take votes, it is majority decides, recognizing that there need to be some procedures to protect the minority so that the minority has an opportunity not to be run roughshod. So we'll be discussing those when we get to the section on debate. Pardon me 1 second. I have my phone next to me and a spam call was just coming in. And oh, I should mention, by the way, I will be distracted now and then because I wear hearing aids and my phone is rooted into my hearing aids. So you didn't hear the spam call coming in, but my hearing aids were beeping at me. So that's that situation. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. So here's the next general principle. Meetings are orderly. What do we mean by that is on the next slide. We take one thing at a time and one person at a time. Okay. By one thing at a time, what that means is we have the agenda. The agenda lists our sequence of business, what we're going to be talking about today. and we're going to take it one thing at a time in sequence. Again, hopefully with the more important things at the beginning and lesser things at the end. It is possible to resequence the agenda during the meeting if necessary, if we need to respond to an emergency. We're not going to get into how to do that today, but just recognize that the purpose of the agenda is to keep us focused. This is what we're talking about now. Nothing else matters. One person at a time there are rules for recognition and debate. You don't get to talk until you've been recognized by the chair. And how that happens, we'll be coming to in just a little bit. But since I've mentioned the chair, let's take a look at that slide next. So you've got a chair over the meeting. In many organizations, it's the president of the organization. In some, it's the Speaker of the House. Somebody elected that person. In other organizations, they'll elect a chair at the outset. The important thing is, and of course, no matter how you decide your chair is going to be, sometimes during a meeting, someone else may be occupying the chair. So the chair, for rulemaking purposes or for proceeding purposes, is whoever is running the meeting at this particular time. It may be the president of the organization. It may be a committee chair giving a report, so they're running the meeting. It could be somebody stepped out and a vice president's running the meeting. So whoever is occupying the chair, the podium at that time, has the responsibility for, first of all, maintaining order, recognizing speakers, keeping the discussion on point, responding to questions, providing context when necessary, putting motions to a vote, and ruling on questions of procedure. Recognize that the chair is not, you need to be a little bit of an authoritarian to be a good chair, but it's not an authoritarian position. While these are the responsibilities of the chair, the reason the book is 702 pages long is because there are a lot of detailed rules that govern each of these 7 items. There are rules for how order is maintained. There are rules for the sequence in which you recognize speakers if more than one person wants to speak at a time. So the chair needs to be knowledgeable about what these rules are, or if the chair isn't knowledgeable herself, have somebody who is by their side. So the chair runs the meeting. The chair, other than running the meeting, is an equal participant. Next slide, please. Okay. The other aspect of one thing at a time, I've mentioned we've got the agenda to keep us in focus. The other part is that all business is done by means of motions. Motions are what the bulk of Robert's Rules of Order is concerned with. There are 84 different motions in the book, one for any number of purposes, and we're going to be explaining those in just a minute. But there are 84 motions because they all have different rules. Each motion has different characteristics. It needs to be moved. Does it need to be seconded? Does it take a majority vote or a 2/3 vote? Can we debate it or is it undebatable? Are we allowed to interrupt someone who's already speaking? So there are a lot of rules to dealing with motions. And we're going to be dealing with some of the most common ones in just a second. Again, if there are any words you don't understand, feel free to type something in the chat and we'll get to it later, but we will have Q&A at the end. So let's start off with the basic. Next slide. In Robert's Rules of Order, there are what it calls main motions and then everything else. Okay? The main motions are proposals to take a substantive action, adopt a policy, state a position. For your purposes at General Assembly, the main motions are your resolutions. What is the business of this assembly? What's it going to take care of? What are we taking care of? Next slide, please. Okay. So at its very basic, the main motion, again, is a proposal to take a substantive action, adopt a policy, state a position. And so when it comes time on the agenda to deal with one, in Robert's Rules of Order, we don't talk about anything until a motion has been moved and put on the floor. There's a process for that I'll be going through in just a few minutes. But the key principle is, one of the ways we keep focused is unless there's a motion on the floor, we don't have anything to talk about. So to put a motion on the floor to introduce one of your resolutions, someone needs to move it. And so a delegate will be recognized and then just say, I move to adopt the recommended actions on resolution X, whatever that resolution may be. That's how it's done at its simplest. There can be some more complicated things, but at basic, that's just it. I move, and then whatever you want to do. Now, in a General Assembly, the motions are going to be, resolutions had to be submitted in advance. They'll be part of your packet. You may have already seen them. So it's probably sufficient just to say, I move to adopt the recommended action on whatever resolution it is. If you were at a board meeting or a meeting of one of your student councils where things may not be in front of you in printed form already, then you would just say, I move whatever the action is, right? I move that we allocate $10,000 to the building reconstruction fund, whatever it may be. So the main motion is the magic word, I move, followed by whatever action it is you want to take. Next slide, please. So then there are 83 more motions in Robert, okay? So these are the most common ones. There's amend, and I'll explain why I have that in red in a moment. Amend means you want to change it in some way. So you've got a resolution or a motion, and you want to change the wording in some way. So you may move to amend it. Postpone, put it off until some later time. Refer, sometimes called commit, refer it to a committee. Close debate. You're tired of talking about something, so you can move to close debate. Or you think we need more time, you may move to extend the time for debate. Recess, we're going to take a break. Point of order is a way of interjecting that you think the rules are being violated, and so you're calling a violation of rule to the attention of the chair, so the chair can make some kind of decision about fixing the fact that there's a rule broken. And then request for information is an opportunity to ask a question. We're going to be dealing with each of these secondary motions in a little more detail in just a few minutes. If you, just as a side note, if you have a copy of Robert's Rules of Order, you'll see that Robert's doesn't really refer to them as secondary motions. It refers to them as subsidiary, privileged, or incidental main. We're not going to worry about that kind of detail for our purposes today, or our purposes of General Assembly. You're either going to have your main motions, your resolutions, everything else is secondary. Now, why I said the amend is highlighted. You may recall that I said that that your own rules supersede Robert's Rules of Order. So in Robert's Rules of Order, once a motion is introduced on the floor, a resolution is on the floor, one of the things that we can do while we're talking about it is amend it. We can change it in any of a myriad forms. Okay? At General Assembly, or I should say in SSCCC, you have a rule that says not only the resolutions must be submitted well in advance of General Assembly, but proposed amendments must be as well. So at General Assembly, we will not have floor amendments on the secondary, floor amendments on your resolutions. Those things will all be before you. However, we are going to cover amend briefly today, because if you make a secondary motion, your General Assembly rules don't apply to those. Okay? So just as an example, someone's tired and says, you know, it's getting a little heated in here. I move we take a 10-minute recess. And you think we need more than 10 minutes. You might get recognized and move to amend to change 10 to 20. Okay? So while we will not be amending resolutions at General Assembly, it is possible that you could be moving to amend one of these secondary ones. Next slide. Very quickly, we're going to go through the process. There's little 10 footsteps there, but there's actually only 8 that we're about to go through. And we're going to go through them fairly quickly, maybe not too quickly, but first, next slide. 1, you have to be recognized. Okay? No one speaks at General Assembly until you've been recognized by the chair. Okay? So there will be 2 ways of handling it, because you're going to have a number of delegates in the room and others that may be attending virtually. So in the room, there will be 3 microphones, a pro microphone, a con microphone, and then what I call an interrupting microphone for points of information and points of order. So if you're in the room, you're going to go to one of the 3 microphones. People who are in Zoom, they'll be muted and they'll indicate in chat, their delegate, perhaps their name, the college, and the name of the motion they want to make, or pro and con if they want to speak. I'm not going to go into much more detail on this because this will become clearer when we get to General Assembly. Just recognize that you do need to be recognized before you're allowed to speak. Next slide. Then you're going to state the motion. Okay? If it's moving to adopt a resolution, you'd say, I move to adopt resolution X. I move to adopt the recommended actions. Some words that make it clear what it is you want to do. If it's a secondary motion, you just state what it is. I move to recess for 10 minutes. I move to refer this resolution to the board for further study. I have a request for information. So the second step is to state the motion. Next slide. The one rule on motions is needs to be clear. Obviously, the resolutions will be clear in front of you. They're printed and they're going to be printed out. But if you need to make any other kind of motion, you just need to make sure you state it clearly so that we all know what you're talking about. Next slide. Someone then needs to second the motion. Okay. Another registered delegate must second the motion. And again, you'll just shout it out or enter second in the chat with the necessary information to identify yourself. A second doesn't come with any perks. In Roberts, a second just means there's another person in the room thinks this should be considered. Probably not really necessary for General Assembly, but it's Robert's way of saying that if there's only one person in a meeting that's interested in something, unless there's somebody else who's going to act as the enabler, we're not going to talk about it. Next slide. The chair states the question. The chair stating the question has some procedural hiccups to it that we're not going to get into today. The important thing is, once the chair states the question, it now belongs to the assembly. And the other thing you need to be aware of it is the chair states the question to make sure that everybody's heard it, everybody understands what it is. If there's any questions about what we're about to get into debating, this is the opportunity to clarify it. Next slide. Okay. Once the chair has presented it to you, it's open to debate. First of all, anyone can participate. At General Assembly, ordinarily, in most meetings, the only people who get to debate are the members of the body itself. Of course, you're a public body. There's some Brown Act requirements or your own rules allow people who are not delegates to participate in the debate. There will be some rules about the sequence in which to recognize, depending upon the circumstances, preference and recognition may be given to delegates over the public. The chair can, there will be some alternation between pro and con. There will be time limits on how long you can speak. 2 minutes per speaker, 10 minutes for resolution. Again, remember, there's a motion to extend time for debate if you think we need more time. The important thing is the chair will recognize everyone in turn according to some rules that will be further explained at General Assembly. And then we will debate the resolution or the motion, whatever it may be. Next slide. Once we're through debating, the chair is going to restate the question. In other words, before we proceed to vote, the chair is going to make clear that before we vote, everyone understands this is what it is we're voting on. This is the motion. This is what it means if it's adopted. This is what it means if it fails. Next slide. Then we're going to vote. In order to vote, you have to be a registered delegate. So while we obviously will permit members of the public or alternates to participate in debate, time permitting, when it comes to voting, only registered delegates can vote. So if you're on this call and you haven't registered yet, by all means, make sure you do so by Friday. Okay. Next slide. When we vote, there are different thresholds depending upon the motion. Most things I've said are decided by a majority vote. A majority just means more yeses than nos. 2/3 means 2/3 of those present and voting. And abstentions, typically we don't even ask for abstentions unless it's a roll call vote. But the majority will decide. It's the majority of those present and voting. So if there are 77 delegates in the room and the motion is 2 yes, 1 no, it just passed because there were more yeses than no. Now, occasionally there will be motions where it requires a majority of everybody present. I don't know if we'll have any of those this weekend, but recognize that occasionally we're looking for an absolute majority rather than just a majority of those present and voting. 2/3, there were some motions that require a 2/3 vote. So for example, a motion to close debate, because we're cutting off speaking rights, we need a 2/3 vote to close debate. That's one of the protections to make sure that the majority doesn't just cut off the minority's right to debate. And then lastly, abstentions. Abstention means you're not going to vote. And again, unless it's a roll call vote, we typically don't care about abstentions because they don't affect the result. Next slide. And then lastly, the chair announces the result. We always want to make sure that after we take the vote, the chair announces, the motion passed, the motion didn't pass. If we've had a counted vote, what the count was. So that is the 8-step process. Next slide is a quick summary. You get recognized to speak, you make the motion, another delegate seconds it, the chair states the motion, then we're all going to debate it. The chair will restate the motion once debate is closed, then we vote on it, the chair announces the result. And it's really that simple, which kind of makes you wonder why there's 710 pages to describe it. But as I said, the purpose of the book is if anything comes up that we're not sure about, there's probably a rule on it, and we deal with those issues as they come up. Next slide. Amendments. I'm going to touch on this very quickly, and that is if there's an amendment made, and again, we probably won't have many, which is why I'm going to be very quick here. The process is essentially the same. The only real difference is if there's an amendment. So let's just say there's a motion to take a recess for 10 minutes. Someone moves to amend to change 10 minutes to 20 minutes. Okay. That's it. Someone needs to second the amendment. The chair is then going to state the amendment. This is what's proposed. The proposal is to change 10 to 20. Then we're going to debate. Should it be 10? Should it be 20? Maybe somebody thinks it should be 15. Maybe thinks we shouldn't be taking a recess at all. The important thing is it's the same 8-step process. It's just that when there's an amendment on the floor, when it gets to debate, we're talking about the amendment, no longer the main motion. Okay? So if there's an amendment to change 10 to 20, and you don't want to take a recess at all, maybe you don't care whether it's 10 or 20, don't bother going to the mic, don't bother putting your name in chat. You don't care whether it's 10 or 20, you don't want it at all. So our debate will be, should it be 10, should it be 20? Once we've decided that, then we go back to the main motion, which was to take a recess. Now, if you think we shouldn't be taking a recess, now you can explain why we shouldn't be taking a recess at all, that we should just be moving on with business. So that's one of the key elements when I say one thing at a time. It's not only just recognizing one speaker at a time, but when we have different motions on the floor, our focus of the debate is on the currently pending motion. So just as an example, and hopefully it won't get this complicated, but there may be a resolution that's been moved, and then someone moves to postpone it till the afternoon session. So to give some people arriving late on a plane. Someone else doesn't like the motion at all, thinks we should just table it. Someone else thinks we should stop talking about it, so they move to close debate. So we now have 4 motions on the floor at a single time. Again, in the rules, there's a hierarchy to these, and the presiding officer, who is chairing the meeting, and me as the parliamentarian will help make sense of it so that we know which motion is currently pending, which one we're going to vote on first, which one second, whether a motion is in order or not. So there is a relationship between all of them. The key is that as we go through them, our debate is limited to just what is the subject before us. Next slide. So for example, again, one of the motions may be postpone or refer. You've got a resolution, maybe we're doing something at 10 a.m. We discovered that the Southern California delegates are stuck at the airport and won't be there till after lunch. I move we postpone this to 3 p.m. Postpone until after we have a legal opinion. Maybe you don't want to postpone it. Maybe you want to refer something to the board of directors for study and report back to the next General Assembly. So you can move to postpone a resolution. You can move to refer it to the board or to a special committee. Again, if one of these motions is made, our focus of debate changes. If the motion is to refer this item to the committee, debate is no longer, should we do this or not? The debate is now, do we want to take action now at this General Assembly, or do we want to refer it to the board for further study and bring it back to us? So the nature of the debate changes. And again, depending upon what motion is made, there may be some controls on how we recognize people during the course of the debate. Next slide. At some point, actually probably at no point, because you're limited on your resolutions to 10 minutes, but in most meetings, you can debate forever until somebody moves to close debate or there's no one else who wants to speak. So Roberts has a rule, move to close debate. You probably won't be using it this weekend because your debate is limited to 10 minutes by the special rules we'll be discussing at the first day of the session. But recognize that in Robert's Rules of Order, if anytime someone gets tired of the talk, when they get recognized, they can speak in favor of the motion, they can speak against the motion, they can move to refer it, or they can move to close debate. Like other motions, it requires a second, a 2/3 vote, because we don't want to cut off rights of the minority. And if the motion is adopted, then we stop talking and we proceed to the vote. Again, I said there's also a motion to extend time. So if we've gotten to the 10-minute limit and you think we need an additional 5 minutes to go over it, then you can move to extend debate for another 5 minutes. Again, needs to be seconded. We're going to vote on it. It takes a 2/3 vote. And if that motion is adopted, then we'll take an extra 5 minutes for debate. At some point, either because everyone who wants to speak has spoken, or because we've closed debate, we will then proceed to the vote. Next slide. Two special motions. I said in the room, there are going to be 3 microphones, one for pro, people in favor of a motion, one for con, people against the motion, and the third for points of information or requests or inquiries. I call them interrupting motions. But a point of order is bringing to the chair's attention that the rules are being violated. It could be a rule in Robert's Rules of Order, it could be something in your bylaws, or it could just be as simple as point of order. What's your point of order, please? We have a 2-minute rule on speeches and time is up. Point well taken. Madam Speaker, sit down, recognize the next speaker. It could be some other rule. You know, if this motion is adopted, it would violate our bylaws. We're not allowed to do that. So you go to the interrupting mic, you'll be recognized for point of order. You tell the chair what you think is being done wrong. The chair will either agree with you and correct the situation or disagree with you. And in some circumstances, if you disagree with the chair's ruling, you can appeal the decision of the chair, and then the entire General Assembly will decide the matter. Then there's request for information or parliamentary inquiry. They're really just 2 parts of the same thing. And that is, maybe you just have a question. You don't want to debate pro or con, but you have a question about something. So you can go to the interrupting mic. And when I say interrupting mic, I don't mean that you're going to interrupt a current speaker, but it does mean when you go to the interrupting mic, that you'll be recognized next, even though others may have gotten to the pro-con mics before you. Okay? And we do that because the question you have may affect the proceedings that follow. Okay? So let's say, just as an example, we've got that motion to spend $10,000 to repair the heating system. Okay? And you just have a question. What's your question? Is this money that's already budgeted and we're just deciding whether yes or no to spend it? Or if we allocate this money, do we need to find some source for where it's coming from? Do we need to steal the money from something else? Okay. The answer to that question may very well decide whether the motion loses or fails. And so we want to get questions out of the way because it's always possible the debate may be cut off before we get an answer to that question. So you're given priority to request information. A parliamentary inquiry is just another request for information under a different name. You know, what's your question? Does this take a majority vote or a 2/3 vote? So we recognize out of turn points of order or questions. The one thing we need to make sure of is that questions need to be real, not rhetorical questions. Okay? If you have a real question, you go to the interrupting mic, you'll be allowed to ask it. Next slide. Now we're going to be at the Q&A, and I recognize that I've spoken fairly quickly, but I wanted to make sure I left at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So that's kind of the bum's rush. Gee, it just occurred to me, that's probably offensive to someone. Anyway, that's the very hurried explanation of rules. What I would now ask is, are there any questions? Because if there are, I'll be glad to go over some of what we've discussed a little more slowly, or deal with anything that I didn't cover that you wish I had.
Thank you, Scott. So we actually have a question, direct message to me. So here it is. During General Assembly, how do we go about breaking up the resolved portion of resolutions so that we can vote on individual resolves?
Oh, great question. Remember I said there were 83 secondary motions? So one of the ones that I did not mention is divide the question. So what you would do would be to just go to a mic, either pro or con mic. It's a kind of a procedural motion, but when you're making it, if you're in the room, just go to one of the mics and wait to be recognized. If you're in the Zoom meeting, then you'll be asked, to enter your, you might say, Jack, Region I, motion to divide. Okay? And that way we will know that you're in the queue and that you want to make a motion. And then the motion to divide the question says, let's say I've got a resolution with three resolve clauses, and you want to debate and vote on resolve clause 3 separate from the other 2. Then you say, I move to divide the question so that and separate resolve 3. Or you might move to divide the question so that we deal with all 3 of them individually. So it's a motion, so it needs to be seconded. And then we'll vote on whether to divide the question. I should say, we may vote on whether to divide the question. And the key on divisions of the question is if the 3 resolve clauses could stand alone if the others weren't there, then you have the right to demand that it be divided. If they are more closely related to each other, then it takes a majority vote to divide them. And an example is if the motion is, let's say the motion is to refer something to a committee and allocate $5,000 for committee expenses. Okay? We have to have a majority to vote to divide that because they aren't separately independent questions. Right? The $5,000 expenses is moot if we don't approve the committee. So if you move to divide something that is indivisible, it takes a majority vote. I know that doesn't make sense. Why would a majority vote to divide something that's indivisible? But it's a rule. But if it's truly independent questions, then you just say, I move to divide the question, and we will do so. Now, let me rephrase that. Under Robert's Rules of Order, we will do so. I need to refresh my recollection to see whether one of your special, in many organizations, a motion to divide will require multiple seconds or even a vote because they don't, we're interested in the efficiency of the assembly, and they don't want to give one person the power to all of a sudden divide all the resolutions. So I need to double check your own General Assembly rules to see whether there's a higher threshold. But ordinarily, it's either on demand or by majority vote.
Great, thank you, Scott. So yeah, if there are any other questions, I'm going to allow some time just so you can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand. Now is the time if you are confused to ask any questions at all.
looks like there aren't any coming in, so I have a question first of all. Oh, I do see a couple of hands. Never mind.
Right. Cool. Thanks, Scott. Okay, so Heather, you can go. Oh, can you unmute? I'll click ask to unmute. There we go. Okay, now you should unmute.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wasn't able to unmute. So I wanted to know if these slides will be available to view again later, and if this is different than the training that will be provided at General Assembly itself the morning of.
This will be the same that I'm presenting on the morning of, unless somebody has some suggestions for improvement. I'm always looking for improvement. But otherwise, these will be the slides I use. And by all means, anyone can have these, and just make sure that you give Jack your email address or whatever, and he'll be glad to send it to you. Or if he wants to put it up on the website so you can download it, that's okay too.
Yeah, I just put my email in the chat. Thanks for bringing that up, Heather. So we'll probably just send it out in a mass email too, just so people can review. But if you want to get it right now, you can email me afterwards and I can send it to you. All right, I got another question, Scott, from the Mount SAC delegate. So at the General Assembly, for points of information and all interrupting questions, we are allowed to just walk up to the third mic without being recognized.
Yes. Well, let me rephrase that. You're not allowed. It's two-part answer, actually. If it's a point of order, you just go up to the microphone and you can shout out point of order. Okay? Because if it's a point of order, if the rules are being violated, we need to know that right now. If you just have a question, then you still need to be recognized. Okay? We'll get to you, and in some, depending upon the circumstances, we may interrupt the current speaker. Probably we'll let the current speaker finish because your speeches are limited to 2 minutes. We typically don't interrupt people while they're speaking because we know they're going to end pretty quickly. And then we'll get to your point of information next. But we still want you recognized because there's no reason to interrupt someone who's currently speaking in order to answer a question that we can get to in the next 60 seconds.
Right. So seeing that was the Mount SAC delegates question, I assume we have a follow-up. So I will go back to you before I get back to a question in the chat, but Streitenberger.
Thank you. Just to branch off of that, in that case, let's say there's a resolution that's put on the agenda, and let's just say like the math doesn't line up and the math is incorrect, and we're having the speaker talk on the resolution. Would a point of information to recognize and just point out that the math doesn't quite align on like maybe funding they're asking for or something of that nature be allowed on the third mic, or would that be probably a follow-up question after their speech?
Probably. So the real key to asking questions is we don't want rhetorical questions, and we don't want questions that are really a form of debate. If your question is really a form of debate, and by debate I should say if it's really getting into why we should pass this or why we should not pass this or why we should change it in a different form, that's not really a question. If it's a real question, then by all means, ask the question. Is this the, if we're dealing with a budget, is that the right line item, or should it really be in a different category? So it's a little bit sensitive. Matter of fact, one of the reasons why I say when we get to the points of order, you can just shout out your point of order. One of the reasons why we ask people to be recognized for points of information is you'll get recognized. And then, okay, what's your question? And then the chair gets to, under the rules, the chair gets to decide, okay, that's a real question, and here's what the answer is, or direct someone to answer it. But if the chair believes that it's not really a question, or that you're abusing the question right, then the chair is going to just move on to the next speaker and you're not going to get your answer. So there's a bit of I recognize my answer is a little hazy there, but that's because there's some judgment calls that need to be made.
Awesome. So I think that answered their question. Thank you, Scott. Are there any other questions? Oh, okay. So I'll get to that in a minute. But if there are any other general questions, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand. Now's the time.
Yeah, I should mention, by the way, that I kind of rushed through this because I knew we were just on a 1-hour call, but you know, when it gets to be 5:30 on the dot, I don't have to leave. So if anybody has any, like I see, for example, someone's got a question about their student senate at Sierra College. So if there are some remaining questions after everybody wants to, you know, go to dinner or whatever at 5:30, I'm certainly willing to hang around.
Same applies for me as well. And I think the delegates are recognizing that because we have another one in the chat. So once at the GA, and let's say my school has a question, when do we have to raise our hand to be recognized, or do we all go to the front as a group? So I'm assuming that's like a group question instead of just individual. I can repeat it again if you want, Scott.
Okay, so I'm not sure what you mean by a group question, because ordinarily just one person asks it, but yeah, the rule will be if you've got a question and it's a group question, then I would designate one of your group to go to the microphone and ask it.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, yes, perfect. Thank you.
I should also mention, by the way, I will be there, you know, physically present for most of the proceedings. While General Assembly is meeting, I will be there, but you're going to be having panel things and other things that are occurring beyond the General Assembly. But I will be there, so you know, anytime you have any question, you know, feel free to, you know, come up to me during a break or whatever, and we'll be glad to chat about it.
Exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand. All right, this is a good one. So what is the etiquette in terms of the microphones in person? Do we stand in line or raise a hand to approach the microphone, or we just go up to it, Scott?
You know, that's a matter of, this is going to be the first time I've worked with you, so I'm not sure what your custom and practice is. Most of my clients just have people line up at the microphone. So if you go up to the microphone, if there's somebody in front of you, just, you know, stand behind them or wait your turn. We will be recognizing mics in sequence, so we're going to be doing, if I recall correctly, we'll be doing pro-con in the room, and then pro-con amongst the Zooms, and then go back to pro-con in the room, pro-con in the Zoom, and obviously with exceptions if there's a point of order or point of information. There will be a little, I'm not going to get into detail now, but we're also going to be recognizing, you know, delegates and the public both. And for some procedural motions, we may be recognizing delegates only, because the public doesn't really have a vote on whether we're going to be two-thirds, you know, closing debate or not. So there may be some exceptions where we disregard the public.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great. So this will be, I see some people dropping out. So one last call for questions. Feel free to ask anything. This is the time, guys. But are there any other questions?
I have one, and you don't need to answer now. You can just put something in the chat or send me an email later. But obviously the first 45 minutes of this call was fairly rushed. And so what I'd like to know is if it was going too fast, was it that I just speaking too fast, or was I covering information in more depth than you really needed to know?
That is a great question, Scott, to ask everybody. So I do see the questions in the chat. I promise I do. So I will get to those, but I do see, no, everything was really well covered. So that's great from Imperial Valley. Thank you. And Heather has her hand raised again. So
Yeah, thank you. I was just gonna say, I think you can never be too thorough. You never know where people are at in their learning about these processes. So I appreciate the detail. And at least for me, it doesn't hurt to revisit this again the morning of, even if it's the same training, to like kind of as a refresher.
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Heather. That's why we wanted to hold. That's why we planned on holding two. So I'm happy you said that because it's just a vindication of what our planning. But okay, I did get a couple of questions. So so from also in debate, if a person is addressed after they spoke their 2 minutes, i.e. question on a point they made, how much time do they have to respond back immediately?
Okay, so there is no automatic right of response. There's no rebuttal under Robert's Rules of Order. So if you feel a need to speak a second time to respond to something somebody said, then you just need to go back to the microphone or get back in the chat room to speak a second time. Recognizing, of course, we may not get to you with time limits. We do not recognize someone a second time if there is someone who has not yet spoken who's still waiting to speak. So I have my own, when I'm giving this is a 45-minute presentation on what I usually take 2.5 to 3 hours to teach, but when I'm teaching at a slower pace, I typically quote Franklin Roosevelt, who said, be sincere, be brief, be seated. And the point there is that when you get recognized to speak, you've got 2 minutes. You may get a second shot at it, but you may not. So when you get recognized to speak, try to be efficient and get your points across because you may not have a second chance. And I recognize that may seem unfair if somebody behind you says something that is just absolutely wrong, completely fake news, and just needs to be corrected. And, them's the breaks. It happens, in a longer meeting with longer rules, there are sometimes ways of doing it. But you have so much business to conduct in such a short time that your rules don't really permit it. Unless, of course, if somebody has done something terribly wrong, that would be a disciplinary offense in some organization, or you need to call them out. You can raise a point of order if somebody's said something that is violative of good conduct and ethics. You can go to a point of order and ask that they be admonished. But again, that's kind of a waste of time unless it's really important.
Great, thanks, Scott. So I got one more question in the chat, and I don't see any other ones. Will the discussion/debate around the resolutions be timed? And I'm assuming that's the entire debate portion as a whole, not individualized people.
Yes, unless your standing rules, unless there was an amendment that's come in the last minute to change them, I don't think it has. But your standing rules say each speaker is limited to 2 minutes. And again, let me remind you, that doesn't mean you need to use all 2 minutes, okay? If you can say what you need to say in 45 seconds, by all means, keep it short because that gives more time for someone else. But each speaker is limited to 2 minutes. Each resolution is limited to 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes of debate or resolution, if we may have only heard from 5 people, it's time to take a vote. Now, oftentimes that's enough. The rule says that you can move to extend the time, but no more than 5 minutes. So the default rule is 2 minutes per speaker, 10 minutes per item, that can be extended for up to 15.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. So unless are there any other questions? One last call, maybe? Feel free to ask. All righty, great. Well, Scott, great presentation. Everybody really liked it from what I'm seeing in the chat. And oh, we got one more. Sorry, my bad, Avinash. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Excuse me. All right.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for answering a couple of my previous questions. I had one more, which is regarding questions about information that are made on the third point of order, the interrupting mic. Who are allowed to answer a question if it's like a question that's like requesting more information about a particular thing?
Right, so if if there's a request for information, then the chair decides who answers it. Okay, so in other words, in some case, if it's a procedural question, the chair may answer it herself. They may ask me as parliamentarian to answer it. If it's a more fundamental question, let's say it's dealing with money, the chair could ask a member of staff or the secretary treasurer to answer it. So who will answer the question is at the direction of the chair. Now, that said, if you have a question and it's not obvious who should answer it, but you have a fairly good idea of who has the answer, then you can say, let's say there was, maybe you've got a question and you don't understand something in a resolution, and you say, I have a request for information. I'm not sure I understand what the resolve clause does. Could the submitter of the resolution or the sponsor of the resolution explain that? That's a legitimate request for information, and then the chair will direct that person to answer if it's appropriate to do so.
Thank you, Scott. I hope that answered. Okay, cool. I see a thumbs up from Avinash. Appreciate it. All right, with that, I am going to go back to, oh, shoot, I stopped sharing. Let me share screen again. I'm going to go back to.
Yeah, actually, we can get rid of the share screen. That way I can see what the rest of the faces look like here.
Right. Okay, I just want to get to our conclusion slide. Let me bring it up. Bingo, slideshow. There we go. Awesome. So just a quick little roundup before we head out, because I know a lot of people have already left and I want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time. All right. So just remember an upcoming event, which I'm sure you guys don't need any reminder of. General Assembly, April 1st through 3rd in Sacramento at the Holiday Inn. Register if you have not already done so. I know I got some questions about that in the chat. So if you have any more, feel free to email the SSCCC team as a whole on how to do that. It's important that all the delegates get registered so they can vote. And be sure to review the spring resolutions packet. Come to GA prepared, informed about what the resolutions are asking, because these are asking what the SSCCC is going to do like in our next term and like the rest of our term, what stances we're going to take, what things we are going to pursue in the legislature. Be sure you are informed so you can have a really good debate and you just have everything in order. So review that spring resolutions packet and review it with your SBA. We want as much student input on it as possible. But with that, thank you everybody for attending this webinar. This was really great. Scott, again, thank you for a great presentation.
Before we leave,
Do it.
I have a direct message from Sierra College Mosley.
Yeah, she said she wanted to ask that after everybody was out. So yeah, unless there are any other questions, I'm going to stop sharing. And again, everybody, thank you for attending. We're really excited for GA, and I'm happy that you guys could all come and learn these skills tonight. But have a great rest of your day.